Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thanks for joining our first weekly live podcast interview of 2025. We're here today to talk. This is a weekly live stream we do every week to talk about digital transformation related topics. And today's topic is getting started with digital transformation in 2025. First of all, Happy New Year to everyone that's here today. This is our first time going live in 2025. So thanks for being here. Happy New Year. Hope everyone enjoyed their year-end holidays, or if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, your summer breaks and holidays and all that good stuff, whatever you did late 2024, I hope it was fun. And I hope 2025 is off to a great start for you so far. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And as I mentioned, this is a weekly live stream we do every week. And this is part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast. So we do these interviews live. We're doing this live right now on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We'll do these live. We'll edit this interview. We'll add more content to it and release it as a formal episode of our podcast called Transformation Ground Control. And you can find that podcast by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can see all past 200 plus episodes that we've done over the last few years. So you can check that out at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And then secondly, I'm going to introduce our guest here in just a moment, but I've got questions for him that I'm going to get started with, but I want to ask the audience here to please chime in with any questions you have about how to get started on digital transformations or ERP projects in 2025. What are those first steps we should be taking as we think about the new year, as we start planning our roadmap for the coming year and years beyond 2025? Love to hear your comments here. We're watching the chat in the stream here. So whatever platform you're on, we'll see the questions. Please drop those in the chat. And speaking of the chat, if you don't mind dropping in the chat right now what city and country you're joining from today. We always love to see where the global audience is joining from today. So if you don't mind dropping in the chat what city and country you're from. Both my guest and I are coincidentally here in Denver, Colorado in the US here today, but I'd love to hear where you're all joining from today. So again, the topic here today, getting started with digital transformations in 2025. Joining me to unpack this conversation is Greg Benton, who is our Chief Strategy Officer at Third Stage Consulting. And Greg, thanks for being here today.
Eric, it's a pleasure to be here with you. And this is our, I think, third year in a row that we're doing the kind of New Year's Eve, or excuse me, the New Year's report. Yeah. So, looking forward to a great conversation, looking forward to interacting with everybody who's all over the globe, finding out about what your digital transformation expectations are for 2025, and how we can help each other as a community move forward in that way.
Yeah, so, absolutely. And
great to be with you.
Yeah. And you've been on this podcast several times now, not only for the New Year type edition, which I think, we always want to start the podcast off on a great note. And it's always, you're a perfect guest for that, to get us started on a positive note every year. So thanks for being here again at the start of this year. But for those that don't know you, maybe they haven't seen you on this podcast before. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, what led you to Third Stage Consulting and what you do at Third Stage?
For about the last 25 years, I've been working with enterprise applications and developing strategies and deployments of ERP systems, the whole realm of digital transformation initiatives. And in all of that time, we've seen a number of advances happen within the marketplace, a lot of changes happening with ERP systems, with the advent of AI, with the move to the cloud, even 15, 20 years ago. And in all of that time, there was really just kind of a missing component. And that was, how do organizations that are planning on embarking on this entire journey ensure that they're going to be successful throughout the journey without having to really just take the gloves off and jump right in. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about today, is how do you prepare the organization? What do you look for up front to make sure that you don't fall into what the analysts say is about a 70% chance of failure in an ERP implementation, right? And it's not just about ERP anymore. It's about all those surrounding edge solutions and everything that runs your business, that makes up your digital enterprise operations, that makes up, everything that you need to be for the next 5 to 20 years. So that's where I think that third stage, and the reason why I'm here, really just is pulling the blanket off of what do we need to do up front? How do we need to approach it? How do we need to be successful in this all the way through as an organization? That's the thing that I love about our business and our firm.
Yeah, absolutely. Is our the ability to be able to help guide those companies that are getting started on their projects and help them navigate it in a way that's smart. And when you look at where a lot of organizations are right now as we enter 2025, a lot of them have new fiscal year budgets. A lot of them have new initiatives they're getting started on. A lot of them are sort of regaining momentum after having a few weeks of holidays and other stuff sort of slowing down work activity. So a lot of times January is the time a lot of companies are ready to jump in and start doing stuff, and it can be daunting. So we want to talk about what stuff should you be doing and how should we get started and how can we sort of not boil the ocean, but get started, incrementally in a way that's sort of aligned with what you're trying to accomplish as an organization.
In the U.S., we have a new president coming into office.
Yeah. That changes things for a lot of organizations, or it sort of changes the way they think about their strategy or their approach going forward. So there's obviously all the geopolitical stuff that goes into effect for a lot of countries at the start of the year as well. So just to help us get started, though, like sort of just starting at a bigger picture or higher level, what do you think organizations should be doing to prioritize as they plan for their digital transformation and ERP implementations for 2025? So in other words, how do they, there's so many things you could be doing right now. We could all be implementing tons of new technologies, and we could be trying to boil the ocean and just going, doubling down on technology initiatives. But how do we realistically get started on that and make sure that we are getting started in a way that's aligned with our goals and objectives as a company?
Well, I think you said it when you said boil the ocean. A lot of organizations decide that, yes, this is the year we're going to embark on all of these digital strategies that we've been discussing over the last couple of years, possibly a couple of decades. And it begins with organizational alignment. The digital transformation is made up of people, process, and technology, right? And very often technology projects are embarked upon for the sake of the technology, and it very often doesn't take into account the people side of the equation, the process side of the equation. Process side of the equation is really what is going to affect and improve our business processes going forward. And so taking a look at where current systems and current processes kind of come together and are not working well, need to identify those gaps, figure out exactly how you're going to approach it as both an executive team and then all the way down through the organization to manage the processes that you want to improve and move into a new way of operating. That requires a very introspective view of the organization. We call that loosely executive alignment, but it's alignment of the whole organization around a move forward strategy that doesn't include boiling the ocean. It includes, in some cases, spot replacement of technology, but very often you have to look at the overall business as a whole and your business planning for the next 3 to 5 years and pulling the planning together. And so we refer to this as kind of a phase 0 approach. You're looking at both the people, process, and technologies in alignment with your business planning as in many cases, a 3 to 6 month view of how are we going to prepare the organization to move forward in a measurable and considerable way. you've seen that a lot with many of our clients. Very often when people don't go through that phase zero and that preparation, organizational prep, then it is a recipe for failure.
Yeah, largely because you don't get the alignment between whatever the overall strategy is of the organization and the digital transformation or ERP project. It's easy to just sort of focus on the technology, the shiny object, and just jump in and start deploying it. But if you don't take the time to do that phase zero, you end up usually getting a disconnect between what the strategy is of the company and the actual initiative. And so it's a way to sort of help bridge that gap and give you a foundation or a blueprint for deploying and pursuing technology in a way that aligns with your goals and objectives. So what are some good ways that you've seen organizations align their digital transformation goals with their broader business goals and objectives in the new year?
Well, I'm a big believer in the business plan. So many organizations just really take the time to get down to what is our strategic plan. How do we put that together from both a budget and a deployment standpoint? What is it going to take from a resource perspective? How many people are we going to tap within our organization to move this initiative forward? What is the total cost of ownership? And how do we measure that total cost of ownership against the return on investment? So nothing measured, nothing gained. If you don't upfront put together that comprehensive business plan as a part of any initiative, you're not going to know exactly who to look for on the technology side for the right solution for your organization. And you're not going to know exactly how much it's going to cost you and how many people, how many resources you're going to need in addition to the people that you have, or how can your internal team and your wicked smart people, as one of my Massachusetts friends said the other day, contribute to the program in a way that is going to be meaningful all the way throughout without overwhelming them, right? So it really takes that circumspect view of how are we going to move forward, what are we going to look at, how are we going to make it happen all the way along.
Yeah, makes total sense. I want to turn to the audience real quickly and just say hello to a few people that have chimed in with their location. Darian on LinkedIn says, good morning. Derek is joining from Dallas, Texas. Thanks for being here, Derek. C. Lynch is here from Plymouth, Massachusetts. So speaking of Massachusetts, I've got at least one person here from that region that might understand the wicked smart comment better than most.
Chris would understand
that. Yes. Yep. And then just not to get political here, but Rasim on YouTube says, I have hope for a second Trump period, less interest, more work. But the reason I wanted to bring up the part two of this comment is he has a strong relationship with tech bros. So it will be interesting to see how, not just in the United States, but other parts of the world, as geopolitical stuff shifts, how does that affect the technology world? How does that affect enterprise tech and digital transformations in general? That'll be interesting to watch here in the coming months in the coming year. But you mentioned before, Greg, you talked about this phase zero concept, and you talked about how phase zero is a way to mitigate against the risk of failure. It doesn't guarantee you're not going to fail, but it certainly gives you better odds than if you don't do a phase zero. Could you maybe help us explain why that is? Why is phase zero so important to mitigating the risk of failure? And more importantly, how is phase zero so important to ensuring that you can be successful in your project?
Sure. A lot of people, a lot of organizations, which are people, really just don't even understand exactly what they look like from a readiness perspective. And so phase zero allows us to step back just a little bit and really understand what is the capacity of our organization, of our people, to undergo the amount of change that we're going to be asking for in both a technical and a process development of a digital transformation. And there are two types of digital transformations. You can talk about a digital transformation with a capital T, as I like to say. So the digital transformation with a capital T, you're looking really mostly at a technology change. And so you're jumping in with perhaps an ERP vendor and you're going straight forward, and you're essentially, in my mind, jumping off of a cliff into, we're going to go straight forward into implementation once we decide exactly who we're going to use for the ERP. That doesn't take into account anything that's going on within your organization, within your four walls, or your multiple walls, in terms of the people side of change. How are they going to react? How are they going to go along with the program? How is our process going to change to adapt to new technologies, or vice versa? How are we going to keep some of the technologies that we have in place that we can't replace right now, and sequence around them and with them to get the overall digital enterprise operations intact and moving forward? So there are so many little nuances that come into this as you're embarking on the whole technology change, that if you don't spend that upfront phase zero piece in really understanding where you're going to run into pitfalls, you're going to run into pitfalls. So that's that's just one of the things that's overlooked in many cases. You just jump right in and go forward. And that's where we very often run into very, very great client partners that say, yeah, we started on this in the wrong way. Can we back up a little bit and restart in the right way? And we are seeing that all the time.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, and I agree with you. We've had a lot of clients, a number of clients over the years that have asked us to help them sort of back up and take a step back, and not to slow things down necessarily, but just to grease the wheels. I mean, really what you need to do at times is sometimes you get so much momentum going on these projects, especially when you start getting in the technical consultants and they just start designing and testing and building stuff. There's always plenty of work to do. Regardless of whether or not you're going the right direction, there's always plenty of work you could be doing. So it's easy to get caught up in all that and sort of lose sight of what it is you're trying to accomplish and what you want to be when you grow up with your business processes, how you want to be organized, how you want to change people's jobs, all that stuff. And so I guess long way of saying it's really never too late to start phase zero, is it? Even if you're midstream, there can be value, maybe not in pausing completely necessarily, although some organizations we work with have put a complete timeout on the project to sort of get their ducks in a row. But even if you don't do that, even if you're still keeping the project moving, you could sort of back up and in parallel do some of this phase zero stuff to help you pivot and redirect the direction you're going with the project. Is that something you see as well?
Absolutely. We have a very great client and a partner that's been with us for many years now. And we completed the implementation of a new system, new ERP system. We are now going back through, and we did process aligning. We're doing process management now and getting to process optimization. And part of the process optimization work is really just tying back the benefits that are being received now in working with the new system, and tying those to, the implementation of the new system has given us certain benefits, but we didn't recognize what those benefits were because we never measured how we were doing things before. So that process mapping and then tying that or aligning it with the benefits that have been received by the thing that should have been done up front, but now it's being done after the implementation. And it's actually producing great results, because now the executive team and the board are looking at some of the things that are saving, frankly, millions of dollars, avoiding a lot of risk in terms of the technology changes and the transformation that's already occurred. But we're doing it in arrears. We're doing it after the fact. So yeah, any point along the journey, phase zero can come back into play for sure, but it's absolutely best to do it up front.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you're just getting started on your project now, we wouldn't suggest just go ahead and get started and do phase zero later. If you can do phase zero now before you get started, that's obviously the ideal scenario. But if you didn't, if you're already midstream and you've already gotten through a certain part of the project, it can be super beneficial to at least cherry pick some pieces of what you might do in phase zero, to incorporate that into your overall plan. There's some interesting audience comments here and questions. Um, First of all, William joining from LinkedIn says, "Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here, William." And then X Devet from South Africa is here, and X has a point here or a comment. Great time for businesses in South Africa to consider transformative drives as the upswing in the economy is foundation to link an emerging markets with the world. So back to the point of, you kind of have to look at what is happening with your business and with the economy in general, and how can you take this phase zero, the planning concept, and the whole digital transformation strategy you pursue. How can you take that and apply that in a way that takes into account some of these macro external factors, as well as obviously the internal strategy that you're pursuing. But here's a question I want to get to that sort of segues into some other questions I have. This is from William on LinkedIn. William says, what kind of tools are there or could there be to ensure phase zero is done thoroughly and smoothly? So maybe could you maybe walk us through, the tools and or just the high level approach, or some of the
Sure.
pieces? I know we've got a whole PowerPoint deck that we dive into with clients to really unpack this concept in a bit more detail. And it's hard. We're consultants, so you and I might have a little trouble unpacking this verbally instead of having our PowerPoint to fall back on. But could you maybe just summarize some of the components of phase zero, or some of the things to be thinking about as we think about phase zero?
Yeah, there are two ways to approach this, right? You can do this internally, and certainly your bright people, your wicked smart people, and the teams that you put together for transformation can really develop an assessment of the organization from both a technical standpoint and a process standpoint. People readiness, understanding, where people sit, how many people would be needed for the initiative that we're about to embark on, budgets, finance, all of that stuff can be pulled together internally. At third stage, we use a series of tools and methodologies that are really just very well outlined in what we call the pre-launch checklist. So on our website, you can go in, you can pull down the pre-launch checklist. That will get you started in a very great way in terms of kind of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps that should be taken in order to really understand where you need to be as an organization to get to where you want to go. Begin with the end in mind, right? So what do we want this to look like at the end? And how do we get there? And then just back into everything that's going to make that happen. With us, we do bring these proprietary tools to understand exactly what the organization is capable of from a people standpoint. We have a number of surveys and executive alignment workshops that we pursue to understand and really quantify what the ability and the willingness to move forward in synchrony is all about. Likewise, we have tools that can actually dive into the technical aspects of the infrastructure, the number of systems that you have working, the interoperability of those systems. One of the other failure points, if you will, for digital transformations is the failure to properly manage data, right? So the data migration piece, the data understanding of the data and item and vendor master information, data cleansing, preparing the organization in that way to be able to move forward is something that many organizations can do internally. but it's better done with a third party coming in and actually providing an objective view of what is the real picture here and how can we help you in moving forward that data strategy and everything else that needs to come together.
Yeah. And I just popped up a QR code that you can use to download that pre-launch checklist from our website if you'd like. So just scan that.
Thanks, Eric.
You bet. I mean, you're doing all the talking, so I had time to go put up a QR code there for you to give everyone access to that. So hopefully that helps as you guys are scanning that, and I'll pop it back up again later too, because I'm going to take it down in a second to get to some more questions, but I'll put it back up in a few minutes. But I do want to get to a couple other questions here that we're getting a lot of questions now coming in. But here's one from X Devet again. How do we package big company transformation strategies for small to medium-sized companies that are highly dynamic and have smaller budgets? I think that's a great question. So how do we right size this whole phase zero concept to scale it up or down depending on how big we are and what our budget is and the scope of our project and all that good stuff?
I really love that question because think about this. I mean, if you're building a house, you're going to go to a general contractor or a builder or someone to help you understand exactly what kind of house you want to build, where you're going to put it, how you're going to go through the entire process of constructing that house. Doesn't matter if you're constructing a 2-bedroom bungalow or you're constructing, a 15-room mansion, something like that. I see the phase zero in the same way. Scaling up, whether you've got, 3 people on your core team or you've got 30 people on your core team for the digital transformation that you're planning on embarking on. The phase zero approach may be shorter for a smaller organization and involve fewer people, but there really is a scale in that. And, the important point is not to avoid or forget that the upfront planning and the upfront, business case for doing this is the important thing. And it's even more important for smaller organizations that may have a limited budget, that may have limited capacity in terms of their people. Their people are not going to be participating in a full-scale implementation of new software that lets them take their day job and put it aside and do something on the implementation project teams for a year. That's not going to happen in a smaller organization. So it's even more critical for the smaller and mid-sized businesses to go through this process.
Right. Yeah.
What do you think, Eric? I mean, in terms of scale, time, size of the kind of the phase zero approach. I think you can scale it up and down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's easy to think, well, we're a smaller or mid-sized company, so it's not as important to us since we don't have the budget or whatever. But the way I'd look at it is actually phase zero is a time and budget saving initiative. It may sound like, in the short term on paper that you're spending more time and money that you don't necessarily have. But the reality is by investing that time and money in phase zero, you're going to make the actual meat of the execution of the implementation is going to be way more efficient, and you're going to have a lot less wasted money, a lot less wasted value because you've spent the time up front on phase zero. And so that actually speeds things up and saves money later on. So I would argue that the net benefit is positive, whether you're a small company or a large organization. Now, obviously, you don't want to get caught up in analysis paralysis and spend, months and years on phase zero and never get to the actual implementation. You don't want to do that either. You don't want to go to the other extreme, but you do want to spend a certain amount of time, for our clients, it could range anywhere from, you tell me, you know better than I do, but a small company might just be a few weeks of phase zero planning, but a big company,
Sure.
We have some big companies where we might spend 4, 5, 6 months on phase zero. Sounds like a lot of time, but when you think of a 3-year project, 4-year project, 5-year project, whatever it is, you're sort of setting the tone and setting the trajectory for how that remainder is going to go and how efficient and effective you're going to be. So is that, I mean, are those numbers sound right to you as far as like the range of how long phase zero typically takes, depending on the size of the company?
I think you hit it right on. It can be 3 weeks. It can be, 3 to 6 months. Very often it's 6 months on larger firms. You mentioned something about the cost. If you look at kind of the cost of a phase zero, it's not that expensive in terms of the whole organization and moving everything forward. You're not at this point buying software, entering into a subscription, implementing the software, but you're doing a lot of the upfront data cleansing. You're doing a lot of the upfront analysis of how are our teams going to come together, establishing governance, establishing all of those things that in jumping off the cliff and jumping in with a technology change, they go forward. Very often you end up stalling after 2 or 3 months of the implementation because your data is not cleansed. Your data is not ready to be migrated. Your people aren't available for testing processes. How many times have we seen that a phase zero can actually reduce the overall implementation of an enterprise system by 10 to 15% easily. So if you've got a 12-month implementation at the end of your full analysis, everything else is moving forward, you can take 1 to 2 months off of that in putting together a phase zero that's preparing the organization to move forward before you embark on the entire thing.
Yeah.
So very, very important in terms of cost savings. And then the time that's saved, if you can shave 1 to 2 months off of an implementation of a new ERP system, for example, that's tens, hundreds, perhaps even millions of dollars saved.
Yeah. So you compare that to the time and cost you spend up front on phase zero, and usually you can justify it by looking at the efficiency gains or the savings you have throughout the project, especially if you're a multinational, multi-site rollout of new technology. It's even more important, if you're trying to figure out how you're going to create a common operating model or common business processes or whatever the case may be. Which brings me to this question from Julio on YouTube. Julio says, in reference to phase zero, understand planning, but without knowing how future state processes can be done, how can you plan just knowing current state processes? So in other words, even if I know what technology we're going to be deploying as part of this digital transformation, I may not know all the details of how those future state business processes are going to work. So how do we bridge that gap between current state processes that we know we want to change, but plan in a way that gives us that blueprint to that foundation for building the technology to meet that future state?
Well, I think that that's a great comment. If you have the wherewithal as an organization to go through the entire current state, future state process mapping and management up front, that's great. Most organizations really just need to look at the current state and align that with what they expect in the future state. Very often, the software systems as well as the process changes themselves are going to come along with your plan for the digital transformation. So current state, understanding exactly how things work today is imperative so that you can understand or see. I use understand too much. So you can see exactly how we want to map that to what we're going to be doing in the future. The software in some cases may dictate that. In some cases, you may want to look at your smartest people, your wicked smart people internally and say, all right, this is the way that this maps out today. How can we improve that? How can we eliminate some of the some of the roadblocks that we see in a given process, and mitigate that with either software or even just changing the way that we do things. It's not always a software question. It's not always a technology question. Very often, it's a way that we do things internally, and that introspective look at what your current processes are gives you the ammo to be able to really just judge how we're going to make changes happen.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, we've seen that with many of our clients right now, that process mapping exercise that I was just describing that we're doing post implementation. Do that up front and do it along the way. To the point of the message that came across the screen, it really is important that you link your future expected processes to the current state, but the current state mapping is important.
Yeah, and when you're looking at the future state, you're obviously in phase 0 not going to get down to the granular screen by screen instructions on how to perform transactions. That's not the level of detail we're getting at in phase 0. Where we're getting at is more macro, looking at just in general, how are our processes going to work? How do we want them to look? And you start making decisions that if you don't make them early on in phase 0, it ends up slowing down the project and creating delays later on. So for example, if I'm a multinational organization and I've got a dozen different locations, let's just say, I may have acquired several of those dozen locations and they've got different ways of operating. And I'm using this project, or I want to use this project as a way to create standard processes across those dozen locations. So you want to take that time up front to figure out how are we going to change those 12 locations into one common set of business processes at that macro level. And that alone, even without getting down in the details of how you're going to do it and configure it in technology, even just making the macro decisions around how our processes are going to work, that just takes time. And that's where the internal alignment becomes so important. And you might as well, I hate to say slow things down, but you might as well work through that messy process of defining future state processes up front so that when you start deploying technology, things are more clear. So your technology consultants know exactly how they should be designing and building software. Your project team knows what the future state is going to look like, all that stuff.
You're exactly right. The way that these things come together, when we're talking about transformation, right? We've got an equation that we often cite, which is old processes plus new technology NT equals expensive old processes. That really just kind of refers to the whole process of improving things for your organization as you go through this digital transformation. Transformation is all about change, right? Transformation is current state to a future state that is much better optimized future state. So it's going to happen along the way. You have to have internal, people, your internal teams that are going to be dictating how this works, how this comes together. But it's an iterative process that goes along the whole linear transformation process. So I think that's a great question that was asked.
Yeah, absolutely. And shifting gears from business processes to data. Here's a question about, because you mentioned data before, and this is from Keith on LinkedIn. Keith asks the potentially controversial question. Data migration has been around for decades with well-structured procedures and established processes. What's the big deal? And how, more specifically, how is phase 0 and the stuff you're talking about, Greg, and all the planning work that should happen up front, how does or should data fit into that phase 0?
Well, I mentioned at the beginning, for the last 25 years, I've been working with especially ERP deployments and the strategies that go into those deployments. And probably 60% of the time, I agree with you, Keith, that Was it Keith or Doug?
Keith.
Sorry. Keith. These have been established for a long time. It never fails. We get 2-3 months into an implementation and somebody says, you know what, our master data is really a mess. We just didn't realize. So now we've got to go back and we've got to cleanse things. And cleansing doesn't mean that scrubbing your data and so forth. It really means that you're normalizing your data so that you can put it into the new system. There are tools to help with that, but it doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't happen, especially in some organizations with, 20-year-old and 40 different disparate sources of data within an organization, that it can all come together and all be nicely managed all the way through. It just doesn't happen that way. So phase 0 is a way to look at how do we clean house before we actually embark on this whole thing. So great question, Keith. I mean, it's not really a question, it's a statement. There are some great tools out there. Tons of them.
Yeah, and surprisingly, people, even though these tools and processes have been around for a while, as Keith mentions, organizations still oftentimes don't use them. So it's important to kind of figure that out too up front. And how are we going to clean our data? How are we going to map it to the new system? How are we going to migrate it? How are we going to handle master data management and governance, data governance longer term? It sounds pretty simple, but a lot of these organizations out there don't do that or think through that until late in the project. And again, that causes delays because now all of a sudden we're thinking about data. We should have been thinking about it a long time ago, but we didn't. So now we're trying to figure out and scramble on how we're going to handle data migration and forget data governance. We don't have time to think about that. So we end up cleaning up data, moving it over, and then we don't have processes to support clean data longer term. So I'm oversimplifying what happens there oftentimes, but that is, I don't know if you agree with that, Greg, but that's a lot of times what organizations do. They put it off as sort of an afterthought and then wonder why their project got delayed all because of data.
Or they put it in the hands of a systems integrator or a software vendor that says, we have these set of tools, we've got a factory, we've got a data migration factory. We'll just basically plug everything into one side and pull it out of the other. Oh, wait, just a minute. Your data is, corrupt. You're missing fields in certain areas. Your units of measure are disparate across all of your global locations. Nobody tells you up front that these tools don't work unless everything is managed to go into the tools. So
right, yeah. You go in with the assumption
agree more.
that the data is clean.
Yeah,
but it's usually not. But yeah, the SI is going to assume you've cleaned that data up and it's ready to go, and that becomes a blind spot in the projects oftentimes.
Well, in fact, if you look at contractually, it's always the organization's obligation to have clean data, and
just
very
present it
rarely.
to the SI.
Yeah. So
yeah, well, that's good stuff. Now, here's a question. I missed this in the feed or in the thread earlier, but I want to come back to this point because I think this is an excellent question. This is from Darian on LinkedIn. Darian says, so we were talking earlier about how it's better late than never to do phase 0. If you can do it up front, if you haven't started your project yet, it's best to do phase 0 now. But even if you are midstream and you haven't done this phase 0 stuff, it can be of huge value to either slow things down, pause, and revisit some of those phase 0 activities, or at the very least do some things in parallel while the project continues. But when we look at those sorts of projects that are midstream, what are some of the most common signals that indicate a project needs to pause or revisit a phase 0 strategy midstream? So, are there certain symptoms or signs that we see with our clients that would suggest that, hey, you didn't do phase 0 and here are the symptoms, so let's go back and clean that stuff up and start to address some of that phase 0 stuff? What are some of the symptoms we should be looking for?
Very much so. There's basically two different areas in my mind. So we see a lot of our clients actually get to a point in the implementation project where they are stalled out. They start doing unit testing and they start doing SIT. Even further on in the project, getting to CRP. The testing is not showing that the software capabilities are aligning with the processes that they are supposed to be governing and managing. Requirements have not been properly gathered, and the requirements are not matching up with the software that's being implemented. And so the project kind of grinds to a halt. That happens very often. We get called in and back up, take a better stock of the requirements, looking at data cleansing, data management, and it's not a long pause, but very often it's a pause that is required so that they can go forward properly. The other one is what we've been talking about with the data migration. The data just isn't there to be migrated into the new system. It's going to cause a lot of the business processes that go on within an organization to slow down or halt because the data is just not ready to go into the new system. They have to revert to old ways of doing things in order to find materials in the warehouse, that type of thing. And that can drag an implementation. So those are the two areas. I would say data as well as business requirements matching up with the software that's being implemented are the two main things that I see. What do you see on that, Eric? Is that?
Well, another one is that I would add to that list is when you start to see the organizational and human resistance to change. So in other words, when you start to see that people are resisting change and people are starting to panic a little bit, they're starting to freak out a little bit because of all the changes that they're hearing about or the rumblings they're hearing about. When you start seeing that, that's usually a sign that you haven't done enough on the change management front, which is typically part of phase zero as well. Typically in phase zero, you're also assessing the organization to figure out what that change strategy should be and what sort of tactics you should employ to ensure that you're addressing the human dimension of change. So that'd be another one I add to that list. And then
great add. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. And then I guess another one too, that sort of popped in my mind as you were saying that is another symptom is oftentimes when there's a lot of uncertainty or lack of clarity around, I'd say it's sort of the architecture and decommissioning approach to technology. So in other words, you've got these legacy systems. We don't really know what's going to happen to them. Are we going to pull the data out of them and replace them? Is that in scope to get rid of that system? How are we going to get rid of the system? Or are we going to keep it and we're going to integrate it to the core, new technology stack that we're deploying? If so, how are we going to do that? So a lot of times you start to, if you can't answer those questions, that's a good sign that you should be having a clear, technology plan, not just for deploying new technology, but how you're going to address decommissioning old systems or integrating legacy systems where you need to. So all that stuff can slow things down or speed things up depending on.
Great point.
Yeah. And just a follow up here from Julio.
I mean, you hit on the one that I missed in the very beginning, the organizational change, the people part. If you run into resistance, halfway through a project, that can kill a project. You're going to have people that are reverting to old processes. They're refusing to participate on project teams. They're being overwhelmed because they're being asked to do their day job as well as participate on the project team. Project team has, been demanding a lot of time over an extended period of time, and projects just grind to a halt. So, I mean, you got to keep the business running, right? So that's what you prevent up front with that, beginning with the organizational change kind of approach to phase zero and getting the people part of the equation in line as well. Yeah. Good point here.
Yeah. I think you were just setting me up so that you're kind of leaving that for me, the softball there for me to comment on there.
No. You hit that out of the park on your own.
So what about, here's an interesting question. And we haven't talked a lot. You mentioned it a couple times, but we haven't gone into this in a lot of detail yet, Greg. But this is from Dennis on YouTube. Dennis says, how do you help organizations understand or recognize if the technology implementation team measures up to the tasks. And I might add to that too. How do you know if you have enough of, how do you know that you have the right team in place? Not just the skills, but also the number of people or the capacity you need on the project. How do you assess that, and how does that fit into phase zero?
Well, that is a bit of a iterative process, and it's a great question because the whether you've got a technical implementation team that is a third party that is outside, that is coming in as a consulting organization, or it's also your internal people, it really requires taking a look at what we call a program management level. So program management is established so that anybody that's working on the project, the PM, everyone else associated with the implementation project is being evaluated all the time. Is everyone capable of carrying their weight in terms of the implementation process? Do they have the right credentials, the right acumen to be able to pull this forward? Are the people on the client side of the equation able to put in enough time? Or do we need to find some backfill, or do we need to find some additional resources to pull in to help the implementation team move forward? And that's the program management discipline that we put on top of the overall project. SIs, systems integrators, absolutely want a software system that they are very adept at putting in place from a technical standpoint, putting it in place, moving on, and they're very bad at self-governing. So if somebody is just not carrying their weight in terms of the project team, very seldom will the systems integrator say, hey, you know what? Marcus is not carrying his weight, so we're going to replace him. They're not very good at that at all. And the transition is not very smooth. Very often it becomes almost, it's a catastrophic thing. We realize that Marcus is not carrying his weight. We need to replace him, so we're going to let him go and bring somebody else in, but there's a gap, right? So the program management, or the overall kind of governance of the entire thing, the entire digital transformation, needs to happen at a higher level than just the project team level. And that's how you assure that you've got everybody participating on both sides, on the client side, on the technical implementation team side, all the way through. So bless you.
Thank you. Yeah, my allergies are attacking me right as we're wrapping up here. But so I guess what I'm going to pop up here on the screen again, the pre-launch checklist. So I encourage everyone who's watching this podcast on one of the visual platforms, I encourage you to scan the QR code. And if you're on the audio only platform, we'll include a link in the show notes below. But while I leave this up on the screen for the audience to scan here, Greg, we've covered a lot of ground here today as far as all the different dimensions or some of the different dimensions of phase zero and how to plan for digital transformation in the new year. And it's a lot of stuff, but if we were to sort of boil it down even more, if you were to summarize, the ways to just get started on phase zero, what would some of the, couple points you leave us with as a takeaway?
Business case development. So you need to understand how you can align your technology goals with your business strategy, right? As an organization. Executive alignment. So really just from the top down, getting buy-in to move forward with the entire project. So those two things, I think, are really kind of the first two pieces that you have to put in place in order to move forward with the rest of it. The business case is important because not only do you determine exactly what the budget is going to be, you get permission from the board, from the rest of the organization to move forward in this way. You also have the resources that are allocated for it. but it also allows you to measure it at the end. So the promise has to be there that we are going to take what we have today, we're going to look at it from a business case standpoint, and then we're going to measure it at the end and see how we did. And I think that's the most important part of getting started.
Yeah.
How would you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the the requirements and the alignment. I think those are, or I'm sorry, the business case and the alignment are really important, because that sort of gives you that you're sort of starting at the highest level. What is our strategy? What are we trying to accomplish with this transformation? Business case obviously
Yeah.
quantifies some of that intangible or tangible stuff. And then from there, you can start to build on and layer on some of the other things that we've talked about, like the business processes and requirements, and even the change strategy. What's the change strategy given now that we fully understand what our overall direction is? Certainly, the architecture and data integration plan, all that stuff can come later. But I agree with you that internal alignment, getting on the same page with what this project is, what it means to the organization, and how, what are those high level governing principles for the project, and how does that translate into a business case that we can manage to the cost and also manage to the benefits of what we expect to get out of it. So I think that's good stuff. Well said. And I think
Perfectly said.
yeah, thank you for being
Yeah.
here today, Greg. Really appreciate it. You had a lot of really good insights. I know you've done a lot of this phase zero stuff, a lot of planning for organizations through the years. So this is a perfect topic at a perfect
Definitely.
time with a perfect guest. So thanks for being here today.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who was joining.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks to the audience for the great questions.
Happy New Year.
Yeah. Happy New Year, everyone. Thanks to the audience for the great questions. Again, we'll edit this interview. We'll add some content to it. It'll become part of a Transformation Ground Control podcast that's released, I believe, in 2 weeks from now. You can go watch the podcast at transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can see all past episodes there. You can also subscribe on Spotify, Apple Music, Google Podcasts, YouTube, LinkedIn, wherever you listen to or watch podcasts, you can find us there, or just go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You'll see all the different platforms there on that website. So anyway, thanks very much for being here. Thanks again, Greg, for your time and great insights. Thanks to the audience. Happy New Year, everyone. We'll see you next week, same time, same place, on another live podcast interview. So thank you for being here, and we'll see you all soon. Take care.